To fall from high or low estate, tragedy and social class and historical perspective. In a famous essay, the agnostic Bertrand Russell hailed tragedy as the highest instantiation of human freedom. Tragedy results from human beings' persistence, he said, in the conscious, imaginative representation of the plight of humanity within the inhumane universe. Tragedy builds its shining citadel in the very centre of the enemy's country, on the very summit of its highest mountain. Within its walls, the free life continues, while the legions of death and pain and despair, and all the servile captains of tyrant fate, afford the burghers of that dauntless city new spectacles of beauty. Russell's servile captains of tyrant fate are instruments by which metaphysical compulsion tortures humans, death and pain and despair. Man, instead of allowing himself to be terrorised as the slave of fate, creates tragedy in order to preserve a mind free from the wanton tyranny that rules his outward life. By transforming the human condition into tragic art, he says, humans create their own world of resistance from which they can be truly free burghers of a dauntless new city-state of the mind. Now, Russell wasn't the first thinker to couch his thoughts on fate and tragic drama in the language of social class, of slaves, tyrants, burghers and freedom. Tragic destiny and social class have always been intimate bedfellows. The ancient Greek word for metaphysical compulsion or necessity is ananke. That's a feminine abstract noun, often personified in poetry as a supernatural female. Can mean the inescapable destiny which gods might inflict on mortals. Some poets even said that the gods were subordinate to Ananke themselves. She's a primordial cosmic entity. She'd appeared in the universe before even the gods, simultaneously with time. Cosmic Ananke symbolises everything that neither humans nor gods have any power to change. The Aeschylean Prometheus, an immortal, laments that against Ananke every skill, technology or stratagem, techne, is unavailing. But Ananke has a transitive aspect. She can actually characterise the relationship between one agent and another. Ananke is often what the French call force majeure. It's what makes a superior power able at will to make an inferior one act or suffer with no hope of resistance. This meant that Ananke, or a word cognate with Ananke, frequently denoted the power a tyrant or despot held over his subjects, or a superior officer over a common soldier. The ancient Greeks already imagined the relationship of humans to the unseen forces which run the universe as the equivalent of relationships between people of different rank and social class. More specifically, cosmic Ananke was like a tyrannical slave owner with total power over her slaves. She has the right to coerce them into hard labour, inflict torments upon them. Ananke could denote the physical application of torture, violence, punishment, or mechanical force. It could also mean the capacity of physical pain or emotional distress to produce involuntary screams. The agonising blows might come at any time, since tyrants act unpredictably and without rationales discernible to their victims. There's no possibility of resistance to their arbitrary whims. And to articulate the deified Ananke's unknowability as well as her ferocity, the Corinthians actually built a sanctuary for her, which she shared with violence, BR, but which, most unusually, custom prohibited people from entering at all. My own definition of tragic theatre is that it's a dramatised enactment of human suffering, physical or psychological, which also inquires into the causes of that suffering. Suffering is self-evidently a universal human experience, and it's not confined to anyone's social class. Indeed, we might a priori expect people lower down the social scale to be more at risk from certain kinds of suffering, such as hunger, persecution, or lack of freedom. And tragic theatre today often portrays the suffering of people from working class or financially distressed backgrounds. Plays often identify as a cause of their suffering, their exposure to an exploitative higher class or to socio-economic pressures decreed by market forces rather than cosmic force, and they can no more evade them than Oedipus the king could evade what Apollo had decreed. Yet tragedy was not so egalitarian in antiquity. Ancient tragic heroes and heroines never suffer because they are born to lower class or impoverished parents. And Euripides' Trojan women, regarded in antiquity as one of the most emotionally affecting of all tragedies, the totality of the suffering caused by the Trojan War achieves dramatic crystallization in the violent death of a tiny child, Astyanax, who is torn from his mother Andromache's arms, cast by the Greeks from the walls of Troy and prepared for burial by his grandmother Hecuba. The play inquires into the causes of suffering it stages, makes its audience feel vicariously. Several reasons are proposed. Hecuba suggests an Anke, or random chance, Tuche. Other characters consider the hatred of the gods, or a god like Zeus, Hera, Athena, and Ares, who are all suggested. Other candidates are Paris, Alexander, Helen, and the Greeks' own capacity for barbarism. That is, the three possible causes of the suffering which the audience is invited to consider are metaphysical forces quite beyond human control: individual human error and human vice. In Edward Bond's Saved, which was initially refused a licence for public enactment in 1965 because it was deemed so shocking, the totality of the suffering of the British working class achieves dramatic crystallisation in the violent death of another tiny child. Pam leaves her baby in a park with semi-delinquent young men who may include the baby's father. The men stone the baby to death. The play inquires into the causes of suffering at both stages and makes its audience feel vicariously. And several different possible causes are proposed, including individual human error and human vice. But instead of cosmic necessity or Zeus or the gods, the chief cause of the baby's death in Bond's play is unequivocally identified as social alienation and economic deprivation endured by the British working class. The human error committed by Pam and vice practised by the gang led by Fred are direct expressions and results of the adult's sordid and boring life experience and their concomitant absence of cooperative ethical values. The tragic household in this play, the home of the middle-aged couple, Harry and Mary, already has a dead child in its past. The psychological misery which the boy's death caused, it's implied, has driven Harry and Mary apart. They live side by side, but they hardly ever even speak to one another. It's also contributed to their daughter Pam's inability to bond with her own newborn, illegitimate child. The implication is that she's suffering from undiagnosed postnatal depression. She takes mysterious medications and is often unwell. But nobody helps her with the daily drudgery of looking after the baby, who's often left to scream for hours on end. Portrayal of lower class life against the acoustic backdrop of the incessantly wailing infant is unremittingly grim. The few characters in paid employment resent their work, and the characters dependent upon them financially have no personal freedom to choose with whom they live. The gangmen clustered around the villainous anti-hero Fred spend their days hanging out in parks and cafes. Class hierarchies are never explicitly discussed, but their corrosive presence is expressed in dark asides. Pam handles the boat's rudder on the lake in the park like a duchess handles a navvy's prick. And the play portrays a world with no metaphysical consciousness whatsoever. Traditional religion is referenced just twice, both times insultingly. In prison, says Fred, he urinated in the padre's tea. The local pickup joint where sex workers find clients is called the church. Religion, Saved argues, is irrelevant to these lives. Bond himself stressed this in a discussion. The influence on subsequent drama of the baby stoning scene in Saved has been extensive. In socially committed tragic theatre and cinema, the death of a baby has become a preferred trope of authors desiring to reveal the depths to which human depravity can sink in the absence of a perceived purpose in life, of inadequate livelihood, or a sense of being valued by the community. The horrific nadir of Danny Boyle's grim movie Trainspotting in 1996, set amongst the lowlife of contemporary Edinburgh, is reached when the baby daughter of the heroin-addicted Alison dies of neglect. Darrell, the working-class leader of Neil Labout's The Distance from Here, stuns audience into silence when he kills the already sick and neglected baby of his stepsister Shari, who's on benefits and can't afford a paediatrician. Although the influence saved on The Distance from Here is palpable, it's probably no coincidence that Neil Labout had previously written 2 plays about dead children inspired by Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis and Medea. His Iphigenia in Aurum and Medea Redux are 2 of the 3 plays constituting his trilogy of one-act dramas, Bash Latter-day Plays 2001. They relocate the child-killing of ancient aristocrats to the lower echelons of society. Labout's filicidal Agamemnon, called Eldad, is a Utah sales manager. His Medea is a blue-collar Midwestern chain smoker who's had a desultory affair with a teacher. Similarly, Frank McGuinness's searing monologue, The Matchbox, 2012, is recounted by Sal, a working-class woman from Merseyside, who takes vengeance on the family responsible for the death of her child. And that's a modern transposition to a working-class concept of the myth dramatised by Euripides in his Hecuba. The suffering and annihilation of a helpless small child, as Euripides knew well, is the most potent possible symbol of humankind's cosmic predicament. Neither Astyanax nor Pam's child, in the absence of an adult able or willing to protect him or her, can do anything to ward off harm. She or he cannot survive unless factors quite beyond his or her control allow it. The helplessness of the human infant is one of the reasons why the Sophoclean Oedipus has been such a perennial favourite of the tragic imagination. The play graphically reminds us that even when a tiny baby passed from hand to hand in Thebes, on Kithyron and in Corinth, he could do nothing, either to annul the Delphic oracle, which foretold his dire destiny, nor to ensure that he died on Kithyron as his parents intended. Every human who suffers unfairly and without another human to blame justifiably relives Oedipus's experience as the doomed baby who, through no fault of his own, survived to suffer unspeakable despair. No wonder dead babies, whether in the womb, newborn, toddling, or a few years old, have been so intimately bound up with the history of tragic heroes and heroines. Consider Euripides' Medea, Shakespeare's Macbeths and Macduffs, or Goethe's Gretchen in Faust Part 1. But there's a crucial difference between Oedipus and Pam's baby in Saved, or between Astyanax and Shari's newborn in The Distance from Here, and it lies in their social class. Oedipus and Astyanax were the most important babies in the Trojan and Theban kingdoms respectively. They were born into royal families, but the proletarian babies of Pam and Shari, on the other hand, live briefly and die cruelly on almost the lowest rung of the class system. I say almost because both Bond and Labout carefully point out that as white children, these babies at least don't face the same racial prejudice articulated by the adult white characters as confront babies born to poor working class parents of ethnic minorities. In the mid-4th century BC, Aristotle surveyed the history of tragedy in order to prescribe how to write an effective example. He recommended the tragic hero whose mistake brings about his reversal of fortune should be the sort of man who has great fame and prosperity, such as Oedipus and Thyestes, and the distinguished men who come from that kind of family line. It's in the Poetics. It took until 1731 and George Lillo's play The London Merchant, or The History of George Barnwell, for a tragedy to be composed with a bourgeois as opposed to royal or aristocratic protagonist. And it took another century for a tragedy with a working class hero to be written. Georg Büchner's Woyzeck, left incomplete at the time of Büchner's death in 1837, was it. Franz Woyzeck is a soldier of the lowest rank, oppressed almost beyond endurance by his captain, who beats him and makes him perform demeaning tasks. To earn enough money to survive, Woyzeck also hires himself out to a doctor who conducts humiliating experiments on him, including that he eats a diet consisting solely of peas. Now, Woyzeck has always been unconventional. He hasn't married his lover Marie because he thinks it's actually natural for men and women to be together and prone to asking philosophical questions. But he begins to experience strange terrors and visions. He achieves some kind of affirmation of his human autonomy only by savagely murdering Marie, the unfaithful mother of his little boy. She's betrayed Woyzeck with a soldier of officer rank, a trumpet major, and Büchner shows how the tragic suffering of Woyzeck and Marie and of their small child, left orphaned at the conclusion, is inseparable from their poverty and low social status. Yet this astoundingly innovative work, by anticipating later sociological and philosophical ideas, appeared well before its time. It preceded by several decades the working class protagonists of the path-breaking tragic novels by Zola like Thérèse Raquin in 1867 and Germinal 1885, and of Hardy like Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure. When Büchner was writing Woyzeck, Dickens still felt that the virtuous workhouse boy hero of Oliver Twist, which began to be published serially in 1837, needed ultimately to be shown to have been born into the upper middle class. Nothing could contrast more with Büchner's searing dialogue between Woyzeck and his narrow-minded captain on whether moral virtue is exclusive to people with money and bourgeois morality. Woyzeck wasn't published until 1879, 6 years after Thérèse Raquin had first been performed as a stage play. Büchner's masterpiece then languished, unappreciated, until its profound originality was discovered by socialist thinkers in the early 20th century. They were no doubt emboldened by such courageous attempts to write proletarian tragedies as Gerhard Hauptmann's The Weavers of 1892, and indeed by Hauptmann's own stated admiration for Büchner's plays. But even Hauptmann's sympathetic portrayal of the Silesian textile workers' doomed uprising stopped short of identifying an individual tragic hero amongst them. The protagonist is the collective weaving class, which soon develops into a destructive mob. Woyzeck, complete with its philosophizing soldier protagonist, finally achieved its first performance, directed by Max Reinhardt in Munich in 1913, and thereafter, in tandem with the Russian Revolution and the Great Depression, working class heroes and heroines began to appear more regularly in serious theatre of all kinds, not only in productions explicitly labelled tragedy. So Albenberg's Woyzeck 1925 introduced opera audiences to Büchner's plebeian tragic hero, and Brecht peopled St. Joan of the Stockyards in 1931 with penniless meat-packing factory workers. By 1936, the 5th Earl of Listowel, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat who supported the British Labour Party and indeed later served as a minister in the Labour government under Clement Attlee, he could write with approval about tragic drama. Contemporary dramatists have swept aside the last of those artificial barriers that divide men up according to the size of their incomes or the purity of their pedigree, and quite regardless of their intrinsic value. The peasant tilling the soil, the skilled artisan in the workshop, even dwellers in the fetid slums or congested tenements of our drab industrial cities have now been summoned away from the obscure corners where history would pass them by to join the small but intrepid band of heroes that rouses anew the faith, the pity, the admiration, the exultant delight of each successive generation of men. Although J.B. Priestley's searing indictment of the exploitation of the working class in An Inspector Calls failed to secure a British performance venue in 1946, and so premiered instead in the Soviet Union, working class tragic heroes really came into their own in the West shortly afterwards. Two of the most memorable, and with the greatest stamina in the repertoire, were created at that time by Arthur Miller. So that's Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, 1949, and Eddie Carboni in A View from the Bridge of 1955. So it seems to me extraordinary that the addition of working class heroes to the tragic repertoire, as so eloquently improved by the enlightened Earl of Listowel, has still not found universal acceptance. In the 21st century, there are still critics and writers who prefer their tragic heroes to fall from high estate, and question whether the tragic and the proletarian can ever be reconciled. The British novelist Howard Jacobson, for example, recently described his quite different reactions to four men whom he encountered all on the same day on pavements in the centre of London. A vagrant begging for small change, a man whimpering in his sleep in a cardboard box, and, he said, there's a third raging the length of Shaftesbury Avenue, looking like poor Tom from King Lear, houseless, unfed, biding the pelting of the pitiless storm. And Jacobson wondered why he felt no compassion for this contemporary poor Tom, before describing a fourth man sitting in silent anguish in a doorway in Leicester Square. He isn't a refugee from the elements. He isn't an unaccommodated man. From the cut of him, you would say he has a comfortable house in Islington, or even Hampstead. Perhaps he's a publisher. Jacobson asked himself whether he's so shocked at the sight of this well-to-do individual looking so sad only because his fall is temporary. Am I a grief snob? And Jacobson continues to say that he's hardly the first to feel the poignancy of a man's fall from high estate to low. However communistical we may be, Lear the King moves us more than poor Tom the beggar. Jacobson decides that the fourth man, who's well dressed, must have had his heart romantically broken, and that not all the poverty and the suffering in the third or fourth, or however many words, can touch me as the story of tormented love touches me. Not everyone, of course, would react to the denizens of London streets in quite the same way as Jacobson. Compassion stirs in different people for varying psychological reasons. Jacobson's own honesty about his grief snobbery, albeit refreshing, does fail to explain it though. Nor do his reference to poor Tom clarify the class issue. Poor Tom in King Lear is actually wholly aristocratic. He's the Edgar in disguise. And the audience is well aware that in Act 3, Scene 4, he temporarily impersonates a mad and destitute servant. For comparison with Jacobson's street men to hold good, Shakespeare would have had to write a quite different role, in which an actual serving class madman was put through similar betrayal by his daughters as Lear, and awarded the same developed psychological subjectivity. And such a role isn't inconceivable, but 2 more centuries elapsed before Buchner achieved it in Woyzeck. Jacobson might more fruitfully ask whether the suffering of the plebeian Woyzeck and Marie would move him less than the suffering of Othello, aristocratic general, and Desdemona, the daughter of a Venetian senator. Buchner based his play loosely on the real-life tragedy of Johann Christian Woyzeck. Now, he was a Leipzig wig maker who, in reality, in 1821, murdered the widow with whom he'd been living before being convicted and publicly executed. But several scenes are demonstrably informed by Shakespeare's archetypal tragedy of sexual jealousy. Aristotle's recommendations were one factor in the notable delay between Othello and Woyzeck in the entrance onto the Western stage of plebeian tragic heroes. And his account of the class profile of the tragic hero also retrospectively fits the evidence for classical tragedy as it had evolved before him and as it developed subsequently. In Greek and Roman tragedy, the principal characters, the ones whose sufferings make the play tragic, are invariably of the highest social class. They are members of royal families. One of the mutually defining generic differences, in fact, between the early surviving tragedies and the early surviving comedies is the social class of the leading characters. Just as Oliver Twist, despite spending his boyhood with the criminal underclass, is shown to have authentic middle-class blood, so the heroes and heroines whose suffering and even enslavement we watch in the plays of Aeschylus, Euripides and Sophocles are all by birth, without exception, members of royal households. But the leading characters in the plays of Aristophanes are almost all born into ordinary citizen families of Athens. They're not even from the upper subdivisions within the citizen body, but relatively poor and critical of the richer classes, Strepsiades in Clouds, Tragaius in Peace, Praxagora in Assemblywomen. The distinction between noble tragic heroes and the non-aristocratic peasants and burghers of comedy remain conventional throughout the history of performances in Hellenistic and also in the imperial ancient theatre of Rome. One objection still voiced against working class heroes in tragedy is aesthetic. The voices and verbal registers of the ill-educated were until recently deemed inimical to the tragic effect. And today it seems incongruous how the factory girl Eva Smith, played by Jane Wenham in the famous film of Priestley's An Inspector Called, directed by Guy Hamilton in 1954, speaks in accents as refined as those of the Midland industrialists who oppress her. It's though the movie's audience could not fully sympathise at that point with her plight if she'd spoken in the strong Birmingham accent possessed by real-life Evas. And 50 years later, George Steiner still described the idiom or idiolect particular to tragedy thus: the resort to complex metamusical verse forms and modified epic vocabulary in Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides is no technical accident or auxiliary, it's primary. The discourse of gods and furies, of sovereigns and heroes, is that of a grammar and cadence under extreme upward pressure. Its formal elevation, its prodigal, its economy, its metaphoric reach tell of a conflictual world, of an often fatal dialectic or dialogue removed from the waste motions, from the hybrid tonalities, from the hit and miss unbending of the vulgate. Now, Steiner is actually incorrect about the idiom of classical Athenian tragedy, in which all characters of whatever class express themselves in the iambic metre. Aristotle said this verse form very closely corresponded with everyday spoken Greek. In ancient tragedy, there was no humble vulgate prose reserved for rude mechanicals, but there were conventions by which the dramatists distinguished their royal characters' voices from those of their subjects and slaves. With only one exception, slave characters do not sing lyrics. Tragic choruses composed of lower-ranking people did not even sing in the same musical modes as the aristocratic heroes, and Aristotle tells us in the Problems. Other conventions distinguish slaves from free, including the almost invariable practice of not giving slaves individual names. Class differences were probably indicated by difference in masking and costumes too. But why was it a generic requirement that the suffering tragedy portrayed was undergone by individuals of high status? One reason is that the ancients, like Jacobson, measured the degree of the suffering undergone by heroes as commensurate with the height from which they fell. Many tragic characters articulate this principle, especially when they lose aristocratic status and become slaves. This fate is regarded in the ancient tragic universe as particularly hard to bear. We see this in Trojan Women. But there is a distinction to be drawn here. The heartbreaking descriptions of life under slavery, delivered by tragic characters, virtually all relate to those once noble and free who have lost their freedom. This does seem to have been regarded as far more tragic than to have been born into servitude. Another factor is the pervasive ancient equation, despite the challenges raised by democratic thought, of moral virtue with good breeding and looks. The words for good and beautiful and excellence and all their cognates, kaloi, agathoi, arete, notoriously well together notions of superiority dependent on lineage and appearance with those dependent on moral stature. Real aristocrats in real-life Athens still had influence. Wealthy families still had a near monopoly on higher offices of state. And a third factor is that all the surviving tragedies were produced under the Athenian Democracy. Athenian Democrats enjoyed watching the autocratic rulers of cities long ago, and with a few exceptions, far away in cities such as Argos and Thebes, they enjoyed watching their prosperity and reputation being destroyed. The experience offered a degree of schadenfreude similar to the pleasure that the public today feels when it reads in celebrity magazines about the divorces and plastic surgery of the super rich. But it also offered a confirmation of the propriety of the political system which had replaced monarchy and tyranny in democratic Athens itself. The royalty of classical tragedy actually also operated at a degree of abstraction from social reality, encoding the new freedoms and aspirations of ordinary men and women in the metonymic language of pre-democratic hierarchies. These ruling class figures might be referred or displaced democratic subjectivities. They contribute to what Pat Easterling called tragedy's heroic vagueness, the special idiom which, she says, enabled problematic questions to be addressed without overt divisiveness. Every citizen, free and autonomous, joint holder of the sovereign power under the democracy, subject to no other single individual, saw himself, in some sense, as a monarch. Princes and princesses may be wish fulfillment dreams as well as social facts, said Kiernan Ryan. The Athenian citizen liked to imagine his tragic self through the depiction of aristocrats suffering the blows of an ineluctable destiny, and so did theatergoers until the 19th century. High social status and the role of representing the community in the imaginary being in ancient Greece, in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, in the Europe of the ancient regime, are virtually self-evident, unexamined correlative. Those writers who still prefer their tragic heroes to fall from high estate use two arguments. The first, Jacobson's argument, is affective. For whatever ill-defined reason he claims we, and he does rather objectionably use the hegemonic we just don't care as much about the suffering of a working class protagonist as we do about an eminent individual. An argument ultimately descended from the ancient perception that falls from greater heights hurt more. Yet the fall from high estate can be satisfactorily replaced with other types of loss. Impoverished heroes are capable of remembering or imagining perfect happiness and of expressing their pain at their inability to regain or gain it. In a beautiful scene in Woyzeck, before the hero's relationship with Marie breaks down, he takes her and their child to enjoy the delights of the fair. And in Saved, Harry remembers how long ago he and Mary had enjoyed a great sex life. In the distance from here, Shari and Darryl remember playing together on their mother's veranda, building makeshift tents on summer days. Falls can occur from states of grace as well as from higher states. So the sole valid question raised by admitting working class characters to tragedy concerns the metaphysical dimension. Working class people can of course be represented in the same cosmic predicament as aristocrats. The human condition is shared by all humankind. Moreover, no social reform, no utopian state, no human techne will ever be able to prevent suffering caused by natural catastrophe, mechanical accidents, human error, or the random presentation in society of violent psychopathologies. All humans are also completely capable of articulating the obvious truth that human lives are lived in death's waiting room. I don't understand Steiner's claim that despite the claims of egalitarianism and political correctness, the perception of the metaphysical, of the agonistic relationship to being, as these are made explicit and functional in tragedy, is not given to every man. Yet a tragedy which made material and economic forces the exclusive causes of the suffering enacted would, I accept, no longer be a tragedy. It would be left-wing agitprop. Steiner asks along similar lines whether an atheist tragedy is possible. Is a tragic vision of the world from which the possibility of God or the gods being excised, is it feasible? Another way of putting that would be to ask whether a tragedy which explains the world in terms of Marxist materialism is possible. To take away the random and unfair element from the human experience, Hecuba's necessity and chance, and replace them entirely with market forces running amok under the rule of multinational corporations. Would that be to place inappropriate restrictions on the scope of tragic theatre? Yet why need a sensitivity to the economic and social pressures on human beings preclude a metaphysical confrontation of humanity's cosmic predicament? Some spine-tingling moments in the most socially critical of plays occur when it is implied that some supernatural force may be at work. Consider the climax of An Inspector Calls, when the Burling family, collectively responsible for the suicide of the pregnant working-class Eva Smith, discover that there is in reality no such person as the Inspector Ghoul, and he's been called to tell them Eva's story. He's inexplicably disappeared, leaving his rocking chair empty. The interrogatory potential of tragedy has here been immeasurably enriched, and ever since Woyzeck, by adding poverty and class oppression to the metaphysical and ethical causes of tragic suffering previously deemed suitable. Let Jacobson hold on to his snobbery of grief, and Steiner deny the apprehension of the metaphysical to every man. I think tragedy can only continue to speak to us in the 21st century because it has so successfully expanded its scope to include the suffering caused to humanity by economic and social oppression. Thank you.